welcome to Mimamsa Conversations. Mimamsa Foundation for Indic Studies is a research forum where we attempt to understand India through authentic, objective, and rigorous Indian way. We do that through well-researched articles, video interviews, podcasts. So do visit www.bharatmimamsa.com to read our articles, interviews, videos, and much more. And Mimamsa Conversation is a format where we take one issue and understand it through its various aspects, various angle attached to it. And we have a very special guest with us, Professor Salvatore Babones, who has joined us, who's become a sort of, if I may use, a celebrity in Indian social media spaces and also in Indian electronic media. Thank you, Salvatore, for joining us. We really appreciate that.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Right. Professor Babones is currently associate professor at University of Sydney, where he specializes in quantitative comparative sociology. We'll get to that, what it is, and his research program. But to begin with, Salvatore, I mean, your shot to fame was your very interesting article on and very interestingly titled, "Who are the India at 75 and Who are the Barbarians at the Gate?" Firstly, it sort of very critically looks at certain indices that rate Indian democracies, or not Indian democracy, sorry, various democracies. Firstly, what led you to sort of critically evaluate these indices? What was the starting point for that?
Oh, the simple fact is that I'm writing a book on Indian democracy. And so researching the book, of course, I went through the existing literatures on democracy in India, came across the rankings, and based on my own reading into Indian democracy, its history and its present, I was really surprised when I first realized that the international democracy rankings rated India badly. I came to the study of Indian democracy long before I had ever looked at these three major democracy rankings, but seeing the disconnect between what I was reading and studying about India and what was coming out of the rankings, I thought this really deserved some closer scrutiny. And since my own background, my own expertise is in the study of rankings and measurement, I thought, fantastic, I can do some research on the rankings. And that's resulted in this initial paper. And I'll be doing further work on the rankings as we go forward.
Interesting. So just your first thoughts, you said that you found a major disconnect with regards to what the observations of the find were. Without going into, without you first going into details, what was the disconnect that you found? What starking disconnect that you realized there?
Nobody can really know what the true state of Indian democracy is. That's something we call a latent variable. It's something that exists, but it's nothing that we can't touch it, right? The quality of a democracy is not a quantity we can go out and measure with a measuring stick. That said, we all have impressions, and the impression I'd received from watching Indian media, from reading Indian media, from reading books about India, from reading through India's democracy debates, even from watching a lot of interviews and presentations by critics of the current government. So, I tell people my India gurus were really Shekhar Gupta and Karan Thapar, and people say, how is that possible that you have such a positive view of Indian democracy? And I say, well, go back and watch their interviews, go back especially and, watch Shekhar Gupta and his previous criticisms of the international democracy rankings. You'll find that among sensible centrist analysts, India is recognized to have a very well-functioning democracy. They're critics of the BJP in particular, but there aren't very many serious criticisms of Indian democracy as such. So in all of the reading I had done, in all of the watching I had done, to be very frank, I've watched a lot of YouTube and listened to a lot of podcasts over the last 3 years that I've been researching this book on Indian democracy. I'd formed a general impression of how well-functioning Indian democracy is. Then when I started to see the democracy indices, which remember are not specifically focused on India. So in my study of Indian democracy, the reason I hadn't first turned to the indices is that I'm not studying democracy in 180 countries. I was only studying democracy in India. I was really surprised to find that the indices rated Indian democracy so poorly, since although I saw a lot of criticism of Narendra Modi and the BJP, I did not see much well-informed criticism of Indian democracy as such. And so there seemed to be this massive disconnect between what even critics of Narendra Modi and the BJP thought about the health of Indian democracy, and what these democracy rankings were reflecting, which was an extraordinarily lower view, a dim view of the quality of democracy in India.
Right. And so, which comes to the very important question, how influential are these indices? Someone like you who's been in academics for a while sort of really was pushed to think a different way, but how does it impact the general thinking about people about India globally? I mean, how influential are these indices?
The indices are really important because they are the only information that most non-specialists will ever have about democracy in India. So if you are a reporter for a major newspaper, the New York Times, Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, here in Australia, the Australian and Sydney Morning Herald, and Narendra Modi is visiting Australia, and you have to quickly get up to speed. What's the state of Indian democracy? And you go to these indices because, of course, you would go to the trusted sources, the Economist, Freedom House, Rise of Democracy Institute. These are highly reputable sources, and you would go to them to get a summary, to brief yourself before these visits. Well, what briefing are you going to get? You're going to get a very stilted understanding of the truth, of the true operation of Indian democracy. Similarly, various second order indices include these indices as part of them. So, for example, the World Bank and U.S. Agency for International Development produce indices relating to quality of governance. Embedded in those governance indices are results from the Rise of Democracy Institute Democracy Index. So parts of the Democracy Index then feed into these governance indices. The governance indices then feed into things like international bond ratings. So India is probably paying, a fraction of a percentage more on its international debt because of the misreporting of Indian democracy in these rankings. Now, a fraction of a percentage is not much, but if you start multiplying that over the hundreds of billions of dollars of government borrowings, if you start multiplying that over because it's not just the government debt that's paying more, all other bonds are benchmarked to government debt. So, every fraction of a percentage starts to have a cumulative impact on the Indian economy. I'll just give you one more example. If investment funds are considering investing in India. Now, I don't mean individual investors. I mean Intel or IBM. They know what they're doing when they invest in a country. They're not going to be persuaded otherwise. But if you're an investment manager and you're considering allocation of capital across countries, and you part of your fiduciary responsibility to your investors in your fund is that you will only invest in countries that have a sufficient level of governance. Well, again, if India dips below those sufficient levels of governance, there's going to be reduced allocation of funds by fund managers to India. Again, I stress, people who are focused on India, Intel is going to invest billions of dollars in a chip fab. They're not being swayed by, they're experts on India. But a fund manager who's allocating investments across 80 countries, yes, will underweight India because of the results of these rankings.
Right. So what you were saying is that there is an economic cost of that, which is unwittingly being borne by India, but there are also perceptional issues that generate for a layperson who wants to understand India. And there is a kind of an individual is already colored because of these ratings, which is really serious. But you also make a very critical point in that paper, and I will urge everyone to go and read that paper, which is available online, because if you want to sort of escape the social media cacophony and want to do some real reading, it's a very interesting paper, and I'll sort of highly encourage all of you to read it. But you make a very critical point in there that it's understood that individual will have political biases, and sometimes it's difficult to sort of maintain those. But what is happening in these indices is much more, wherein there is sort of, if I may interpret you, there is a sort of concerted way to paint some certain institution or democracy like India in a peculiar way. Why do you say that? I mean, it's almost sort of assuming that there is an agenda behind that.
Here we get into speculation. So I want to be clear, this is speculation. This is not something I can document with actual numbers. But it is very suspicious to me. It sends up a red flag when I see that those democracy rankings that are primarily based on the in-house judgment of Western experts, the Economist Intelligence Unit ranking, ranks India, relatively speaking, higher. The ranking that uses some input from within country experts, Freedom House is in the middle on India, and the ranking that is based overwhelmingly on the opinions of people who are in the country, and specifically experts on the country or political scientists in the country, that their evaluations are what feed the rankings. Writers of Democracy Institute has by far the dimmest view of Indian democracy. Now, this suggests to me that people who are closer to the action, who know India better. I mean, let's be honest, a political scientist at an Indian university knows India better than an analyst at the Economist Intelligence Unit who covers all of South Asia. Right. So we're getting the people who know India better, but those who know India better are rating India worse. Now, from a purely intellectual standpoint, this could be because they know the truth, and because they know the truth of how bad things are, it's reflected in poor rankings, while those who don't know the full truth about how bad things are give India a pass. That's possible. However, it's also possible that those who are more personally involved are biased in their viewpoints and allow their biases to affect their viewpoints. Now, if I take this correlation between the closeness to the subject and the lower rankings, if I take that and then add to this the other circumstantial evidence, which is that I know that the intellectual class in India is thoroughly anti-Modi, anti-BJP.
True.
I mean, and I've had some debates on it. People wanted to argue this point. It's so obvious that I don't think it's really worth arguing. The Indian intellectual class is as a class, not every single individual, thoroughly opposed to Narendra Modi and the BJP. Well, the suggestion now creeps in that since India's democracy rankings specifically on those that are focused on the opinions of Indian intellectuals, that those democracy rankings are precisely the ones that since 2014, and specifically between 2014 and 2015, ascertained a collapse in the quality of Indian democracy. I can't help but draw the obvious conclusion from that. I can't demonstrate it; it's all circumstantial evidence. But I think the picture the picture that you get from this is just so, I think, so obvious to a neutral observer that any neutral observer would take that view.
So you're just saying there is not only an ideological angle to it, there is a stark political angle, which is at least apparent if you cannot demonstrate it by numbers, but it is at least apparent there that there is a political angle to it. And I think, which is what also endeared you to a lot of people and antagonized you, because you talked about intellectuals. And, intellect, if you if you followed Indian debate for a while, intellectuals have been into center of storm for a while. They've been criticized within India for being very adversarial to the government. Criticizing is fine, but adversarial to the government and thereby adversarial to the entire, which sort of comes to the next point when you also, another shot for fame was your India Today Conclave interview, where you came to a lot, you actually were witnessed by a lot of people in India. But you specifically talked about intellectuals. And so, there is a feeling among India that there are Indian intellectuals, and then there are Western intellectuals equally are sort of looking at India and sort of having their equal share in demonizing Indian democracy. Do you share that view? There is an equally...
No, I mean, except for a small number of Western intellectuals who spend most of their careers in India, Western intellectuals take their views of Indian democracy almost entirely from the anecdotal stories of Indian intellectuals. So when we had a former president of the Indian Sociological Association visit the University of Sydney, that person told us that India under Modi had descended into fascism. Modi was a fascist and India was a fascist country. Now, how would we at the University of Sydney form our views of India? Well, people we trust. Fellow sociologists who are well respected in India, who are well published, who publish in international journals, they're telling us that India is a fascist country. And I want to stress, whenever we get to these kind of amorphous qualities like democracy, what we technically call latent variables, things that can't be manifestly observed, we don't have any external validation. God is never going to step in and tell us the true state of Indian democracy. How do I know the state of Indian democracy? Well, I listen to people I trust. And the people I'm likely to trust as a Western sociologist are those Indian sociologists who are prominent enough that they publish in Western English language sociology journals, that they attend international conferences. Those are the people whose message about India is going to reach the West. I mean,
Right.
India exists for the West in an information-poor environment.
Right.
We all have opinions. I mean, you and your viewers all have opinions about the United States, about Joe Biden, about
Right.
Donald Trump, about American politics, who you think should run against Biden. Should Biden step down and allow someone else to run? All of you have opinions about this. However, most Americans, even most well-educated Americans, I would dare say even most university professor Americans, couldn't name any Indian politician other than Narendra Modi.
Okay.
No one would know who Yogi Adityanath is. They would know that there's some Gandhi, but do they know that it's Rahul Gandhi or Sonia Gandhi? Or they certainly wouldn't have heard of Shashi Tharoor, right? So when you think of outsiders looking at India, our knowledge of India is very thin, and thus the sorts of generalizations that, if you have an American friend who says America under Donald Trump turned into a fascist state, you would probably roll your eyes. You may or may not like Donald Trump, but you're not going to believe that America is actually a fascist with, SS, Gestapo running around arresting people. You know that it's an exaggeration. But when we hear someone say India's a fascist state, why should we doubt that? We have no other framework within which to understand India. So that information poor environment allows a small number of elite internationalized Indians to completely shape the international narrative about India.
Okay, then that's even more concerning, if I may put it that way, that there is the international opinion is heavily shaped by the Indian opinion, and that sort of translates as an international opinion. But it is actually an Indian opinion on India, if I'm sort of framing you correctly.
Right.
But also tell me generally about, well, you talked about that there is an information poor atmosphere in the United States at least, but how generally people who are not so academically colored, if I may use that word, what is their perception about India generally? So your peers who sort of look at India, someone who's been talking to you because of your research and stuff, like what is the general impression on that?
Outside academia, I've mainly discussed India with business people. Business people are very keyed into India in terms of the opportunity of the market. But there is in Australia, as I am American, but I live in Australia. So if you ask about my personal conversations with Australian business people, there's very much an old British Raj vision of India. I would say it's, first of all, they think that India is still a Nehruvian socialist country. They'll talk about the license Raj as if it still exists.
They
believe that nothing has been, nothing is electronic. Everything is paper forms with stamps on them. So there's this 30, 40 year out of date view of India. I would say a pre-1992 understanding of India among business people who don't specifically do business in India. Of course, those who actually invest in India have a very up-to-date understanding, but that's a small sliver of the business community in Australia.
Right. Also, you also mentioned about, and it's right that we sort of tend to have certain opinions about United States, about other countries. But let me sort of quiz you further on this. Is this a general problem about intellectuals of using hyperboles, like something has turned into a fascist? Obviously, it's far from reality. I mean, there could be certain authoritarian tendencies creeping up here and there, but is it a general tendency among the intellectual class to use such hyperboles in academics?
Personally, I think the whole death of democracy literature is characterized by this overuse of hyperbole. Democracy has been dying, since before I was born. You can go back to the 1920s, 1930s, even after World War II. There are always articles in the academic literature about the death of democracy. We're always just one step away from democracy being destroyed in America, in Europe, in the world. And it never quite gets there. So there is this tendency to hyperbole, which maybe is what helps keep the world better, and that we're always worried about these worst case scenarios. I'm not educating anyone there. I mean, all of you are aware that calling people Nazis has become such a trope that real Nazis must be ashamed about all the people who are associated with them. There are virtually no Nazis anymore anywhere in the world. I mean, there may be a small number in Germany. There's nobody in Australia and the US who's really a Nazi. Yet we're all called Nazis. And so we have to shrug our shoulders and not take it too seriously. So yes, this hyperbole is there, but it's always been there. It's nothing new. And people who say that this over emotional language is something that's just arrived because of social media or because of the polarization of politics, I tell them, look, I've been politically conscious now for 40 years, and I've seen it ever since. Ronald Reagan, when I was a teenager, was routinely called a fascist. When Ronald Reagan went to Germany, went to West Berlin, and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," the West Berliners themselves were protesting his presence as this militaristic American, who was going to drag them into World War III. It's just a fact of life. People have been throwing around these terms forever.
Right, and I also sort of draw some of your own works. You've written a book on Trump, and I think you've also worked on regarding the liberals generally and the political intervention that they do. I think some of the debates are quite familiar in Indian context also. I mean, we've been also talking about the death of democracy for a while, and some scenario when the entire thing is going to just crumble down. But as you said, it just never comes to that. Which sort of brings me to the next important point about the public discourse. Something that a lot of people talk about Indian public discourse as a circus, as a cacophony, not really very serious. Public discourse being
what you're saying, people talk about America that way?
No, India. I mean, a lot of people.
I'm joking, because people do talk about America in exactly the same way.
I understand. Yes. I was about to quiz you on that. I mean, this is almost an aping of similar ideas everywhere. But what is your, just your experience? Are you enjoying the fame that you're getting? Because I'm assuming your one paper and that one interview has made you a household name for a lot of people.
Well, look, it's been gratifying that so many people have cared to read the paper, to talk to me, to reach out to me, and I do appreciate that. People like you doing all of these interviews, I appreciate it. That said, it's not something I sought. I have no. This may sound strange of me to say it. I have no particular interest in India. I've been studying India as a case study in democracy. So I do have a particular interest in democracy. And for me, India was this incredible case of a successful democracy in a developing country. Now, the Indian notoriety that I've acquired has led me to focus more on India in my public writing. So I've been writing more about India. I'm working with members of the Indian Australian community here to set up an India-focused think tank. But again, not so much focus on India itself as on portraying India or creating a factual account of India that's accessible to the rest of the world. I think there's a real opportunity there to teach the world about India. And fundamentally, what I am is a teacher. And so I'm very happy to play that role. But it's been a bit amusing. It's been a bit funny. Of course, it's been gratifying, but I promise it's not something I sought. And in fact, I had never even visited India before India Today invited me. And I thought, the invitation from India Today was just too good to pass up. And can I just add one more thing? I want to stress, people say that, I mean, I've been called all sorts of names and people say I'm a Modi Bhakt and all of this. And I point out to them, the person who invited me to India was Arun Puri. I wasn't brought to India by the government. I was brought to India by India Today magazine. And I think that, and they knew exactly what I was going to say. And I think what I've had to say to India is something that I'm gratified has been broadly embraced, not by the most extreme parts of the intellectual establishment in India, but broadly by Indian educated society, whether they're for Modi, against Modi, that they seem to understand that, this message is one that needs to get out, that India is a quality democracy, regardless of what you think of the current government of India.